Right, guys, so while I'm doing this, I'll point out one of the things I think is a bit of an issue. So we've got the light intensity on a movie screen varies inversely. Now, what I saw was some people trying to use a table method, which is fine, but you need to do it correctly. All right, so let's, I'm going to do the table method afterwards, but let's do the formula method. So first off, I think one problem that some people are confusing themselves with are the letters given to the variables. You've used x's and y's, which isn't a problem, but let's use things that I know what I'm looking at. So what can I use instead of light intensity? I. Let's use an I. Again, I'm just going to use a capital I. It doesn't have to be. Better than a small I, just capital I. Varies inversely with the square of distance. D, I'm going to use little d for distance. So if I take that into consideration, look, certain things, it varies inversely and the square of the distance. They're the important things. So remember that means that I varies with 1 over d squared. All right? What does the fishy symbol get replaced by? K. So we've got I equals K divided by D squared. Now, I said to Taylor that hers is going to look a little bit different to mine. That's because she wrote it the other way around. She wrote D squared is equal to K divided by I. Which again, is not a problem. It doesn't matter, as long as it's the square of the distance. But I'm going to use this just because I'm now going to use the information that's been given to work out K. So when the screen is 3 meters from the projector, so that is D. All right. The light intensity is 24 units, so that's I. So I can put that in here. So when I is 24, D is, what did we say? 3? Well, not yet. That's the information you've been given in a really basic question, right? Remember I said in that exercise, some of them are giving you the numbers, some you have to take your own. Well, that's what it would be if I equals 24, D equals 3. We'll use that to figure out K. And if we put that in, we get 24 equals K divided by 3 squared, which means that 24 times 9 equals K. So you've got K ends up being 216. So we've then got I equals 216 over D squared. That's my formula. All right? Now, you are then given the second part of the question, which says, what happens, all right, if the light to the light intensity if the screen is 6 meters away? So we're basically being now asked if I equals what when D equals 6. So some people jump straight to, oh, well, if you double one, you half the other. But we need to use the formula just to confirm. So we've got I equals 216 divided by 6 squared. And if we do that, we get I is equal to 6 units. Okay, now just to point out the table method. Guys, if you're going to do the table method, we've got I, what did we say? I was, so D was 12. No, sorry, I'm 24 and 3. 24 and 3. Now, if we're going to use the table methods, and it says, right, move that to 6, So we say that has been times by 2, but if you remember how to use the table method, well, this needs to be divided by, well, if it was purely an inverse relationship, it would just be divided by 2, but it's a squared, so we have to divide by 2 squared. So 24 divided by 4 is 6. So we can use that method if we want. But that easier method comes from having a better understanding.
That's 100. You're right.
Now,
24 divided by 144. That's not 2 squared. I meant
2 squared is 4.
I'm sleeping like either.
Right. The next thing says, describe what happens to the light intensity when the distance between the projector and screen is halved. Alright? So, now we've got a couple of options with that, which is we've got a formula now, right? We've got this formula, we could just put it in. We can put in some just arbitrary values. We've got some actually. Right. So if the distance is halved, what method can we use now? No, nothing else has changed. It's still inverse, right? What did we do here? The distance was doubled. This time it's saying, well, what if we half it?
Make a table.
Well, we could make a table. So I'm going to go through the 2 options for you here. All right. So they're saying if D is halved, okay, what happens to I? Now, that kind of question, if I put in an assessment, that quite often leads to an issue where people go, but what was it before? You know, I need some numbers to work out, but we actually don't. But let's say we are in this situation, we're in assessment, and we kind of want to answer, go, well, what's happening? Well, we do actually have some information already that we can work from, which is, what did we say? It was 4, 24 and 3. And we've got 6 and 6. But what we actually want, if D is halved, well, this was doubled. But do I already have the information to point out what happens if it's halved? So this was times 2. This was divide by 4. Alright? Do I need to put another line in for, or shall I do 3, well, what if it was 1.5? Do I need to work that out? Would that be one way of doing it? Is there any much easier way of doing it? So if D is halved,
D is 12.
how is that halving?
Because the table would go on and then it would be 24, so 12 and a half or 24.
So I want to know when D, like if I did this, look, that would be the divide by 2 thing. But I don't actually need it. Emily? So we're starting that, guys. If I want to know when D is halved, I've got that number. I could come up with another number, and I could say, well, that's halved, divide by 2. If I've used this method, well, it makes sense that if I divide by 2, it's going to be timesing by 2 squared. So by 4. Right? Now, this question specifically says, if D is halved, what happens happens to I don't need, by the way, it's doing my nutting. Now I'm on video, you guys with your giggling. Sorry, you coming back, he can't cope with it. Right? You stop or you split, divide. Yeah? I will divide and conquer, or you can just stop being immature. Alright, so we can divide by 2, and will that always be the case in this situation? Yes, that's the nature of it, right? But I just wanted to point out, isn't timesing by 2, if I just did it the other way, isn't that dividing by 2? Yeah? So if timesing by 2, doubling it, divides by 4, well, surely doing it the other way around, dividing by 2, would just mean it's timesing by 4. And I get the same answer. Alright? So in this case, if d is divided by 2, I is multiplied by 2 squared, or times by 4. Alright? That's the answer to that question. Right? Using the table method. So you need to write that down. Right? Because I'm going to go through the other methods so that you can do part C yourself. But write down, what you've listened to, what's on the board. Alright, the other method is to do it using the formula, right? The formula we had is I equals 216 divided by d squared. Now, if you want to know the general impact of doing something to either I or to d, alright, you can actually do it using this formula. Alright, so part C will involve that. Now, I'm going to do the process. So if d is halved, I don't know if that makes sense. So divide by 2. What we can do is we can change this. So I want to know what happens to I when I do 216 divided by, I'm going to put brackets around that, and I'm going to say it's now half of d. Does that make sense? So that half is what happens to, it's not what d equals, it's what happens to d. It's divided by 2. I've got half of d. Okay? Alright. What I need to do now, though, is I need to apply this squaring to d and the half. Because that's basically what we do. Alright? And we get 216 divided by, well, it's going to be d squared, but what is a half squared? What's squaring? So what's a half times a half? Half of a half? Quarter. Okay. So now I need to figure out what has happened here. Well, what's the same thing as dividing by a quarter? Multiplying by 4. Alright? Dividing by a quarter is the same thing as multiplying by 4. So, this here makes it 4 lots of I when I compare it to the original one. Okay? So I can now see that if d is halved, I is multiplied by 4. Takes a little bit more kind of understanding of algebra, and I'll invite you back at lunchtime to write the notes. Yeah? Because you've not written anything for 5 minutes and you're about to leave. See you at lunch? Might have to go out and get some food, so you'll have to sit around and wait. Does that make sense, guys? It's a bit of a tricky one. That should This method, we'll talk about how that helps us with part C next time.